A convicted murderer becomes the most powerful financial mind in Europe, controls more wealth than entire nations combined, and engineers an economic bubble so catastrophic it nearly topples the French monarchy. His paper money scheme made peasants millionaires overnight, while simultaneously creating a word that still haunts markets today: millionaire. John Law didn't just gamble with cards, he gambled with an entire kingdom's future, turning France into history's most spectacular financial experiment. Within 3 years, he transformed a bankrupt nation drowning in debt into a speculative frenzy, where a single share of stock cost more than a Parisian mansion. Then, it all vaporized. Fortunes built over months disappeared in days. Riots erupted in the streets. People who'd burned their furniture for cooking fuel weeks earlier because they'd converted everything to paper shares now held worthless documents. The French economy imploded so violently that the nation wouldn't fully trust paper currency again for another century. But here's what nobody tells you. John Law's radical ideas about banking, credit, and monetary theory were actually centuries ahead of their time. The same mechanisms that destroyed France in 1720 form the foundation of every modern economy today. Central banks, paper currency, government bonds, stock markets, Law pioneered them all. This is the story of how one man's brilliant, reckless, revolutionary vision created the blueprint for contemporary finance, while simultaneously engineering its most spectacular crash. John Law died in poverty in Venice in 1729, living in a rented room, sustained by a small pension from a distant relative. His fortune evaporated, his name synonymous with financial catastrophe across Europe. 9 years earlier, he'd been the most powerful economic force in France, controlling the national bank, the tax collection system, the tobacco monopoly, the national mint, and a colonial trading empire spanning from Louisiana to China. The French regent Philippe d'Orléans consulted him on every major policy decision. Foreign ambassadors courted his favor. His banking theories reshaped how an entire civilization thought about money itself. The distance between these two realities, absolute power and complete ruin, represents one of history's most dramatic rises and falls. What makes Law's story particularly fascinating isn't just the scale of his success or the magnitude of his failure, but the fact that he was simultaneously completely right and catastrophically wrong. His economic theories were sound, even visionary. His execution was disastrous. Born in Edinburgh in April 1671, Law came from comfortable circumstances. His father, William Law, was a successful goldsmith and banker who'd accumulated substantial wealth serving Scotland's aristocracy. The family lived well, employing servants, owning property, connected to Edinburgh's merchant elite. Young John received an excellent education, studying mathematics, which would later prove his most valuable skill. He showed early brilliance with numbers, able to calculate complex probabilities in his head, a talent that served him first at gambling tables and later in financial markets. But Law wasn't destined for a conventional banking career. He possessed something his father lacked: charisma bordering on recklessness. Tall, handsome, charming, and supremely confident, Law gravitated toward London's fashionable circles rather than Edinburgh's counting houses. By his early 20s, he'd become a fixture in London's gambling dens, coffee houses, and aristocratic salons. He dressed extravagantly, courted beautiful women, and won consistently at cards, not through cheating, but through mathematical probability calculations that gave him consistent edges over opponents who played on intuition. What most people don't know is that Law's entire financial philosophy emerged from his gambling experience. At card tables across London, he observed how people valued things, not based on intrinsic worth, but based on perception, confidence, and belief. A skilled player could bluff with worthless cards and win pots worth hundreds of pounds. The cards themselves had no value. The value existed in players' minds, in their collective agreement about what those cards represented. This insight would later form the foundation of Law's revolutionary theories about paper money. Behind the glamorous lifestyle was a sharp, analytical mind constantly working. Law filled notebooks with probability calculations, economic observations, and theoretical frameworks about value and exchange. He read voraciously: political economy, Trade theory. Monetary philosophy. While his peers gambled for entertainment, Law gambled as applied mathematics research, each hand another data point in his understanding of risk, reward, and human behavior. This wasn't just about making money through cards, it was about understanding the fundamental nature of value itself. Law became obsessed with a question that would haunt him throughout his life. Why did economies stagnate when plenty of valuable goods, willing workers, and productive capacity existed? His answer, radical for the time, was that economies suffered from insufficient money supply. Trade couldn't happen without medium of exchange. Economic potential remained trapped, locked away, because rigid monetary systems based on scarce precious metals couldn't expand to match productive capacity. Let me take you back to London in 1694, where Law's theoretical musings were about to collide violently with reality, transforming him from fashionable gambler into fugitive murderer, setting in motion a chain of events that would ultimately reshape European finance forever. Chapter 1. Gambler's Start. John Law's hands moved across the card table with practiced precision, his eyes calculating odds faster than his opponents could process their own cards. Bloomsbury Square, London, April 9, 1694. The private room smelled of tobacco smoke, expensive wine, and the particular tension that accumulated when substantial sums changed hands. Law, just 23 years old, had already won £400 that evening, roughly equivalent to 3 years' wages for a skilled craftsman. His opponent, Edward Wilson, was losing badly and drinking heavily, a dangerous combination. Wilson came from good family, minor aristocracy with enough status to matter in London's social hierarchy. Law came from merchant stock, wealthy but not titled, which created a peculiar dynamic in England's rigidly stratified society. Wilson could lose a fortune at cards and maintain his social position. Law could win that same fortune and still be considered an upstart. The tension simmering between them contained layers beyond money, class resentment, professional jealousy, and personal animosity that had been building for months. What started as a card game had evolved into something more dangerous. Wilson accused Law of cheating, a deadly serious charge in an era when a gentleman's honor was literally worth killing for. Law, whose mathematical abilities gave him legitimate advantages at cards, hadn't needed to cheat. He'd simply played better, calculated more accurately, and maintained discipline, while Wilson grew reckless. But explaining probability theory to a drunk, angry aristocrat wasn't going to diffuse the situation. The argument spilled out of the gaming room into the street. Other gamblers followed, some hoping to prevent violence, others excited by the prospect of witnessing a duel. Dueling was illegal in England by 1694, but the law was inconsistently enforced, particularly among the upper classes who considered it a legitimate method of defending honor. Wilson challenged Law formally, and Law, trapped by social conventions and masculine pride, accepted. They met the next morning in Bloomsbury Square, a fashionable residential area where duels were occasionally fought before residents awakened. Each man brought a second as protocol demanded. The weapons were swords, the traditional choice for gentlemen's duels. Law, despite his gambling success, had no particular reputation as a swordsman. Wilson was considered competent but not exceptional. The duel began awkwardly. Neither man was an expert fencer, and the early exchanges showed more determination than skill. They circled each other on the grass, their blades clashing intermittently, neither gaining clear advantage. Then Law made a move. Accounts differ on whether it was skillful or simply fortunate, and his sword penetrated Wilson's defenses, striking him in the stomach. Wilson collapsed. Blood soaked through his shirt rapidly. The wound was clearly serious, possibly fatal. Law, suddenly confronted with the reality of what he'd done, stood frozen. His second urged him to flee immediately, remaining at a murder scene. Even a death resulting from a duel could mean execution. But Law lingered. Watching Wilson's friends attempt to staunch the bleeding, the mathematical gambler suddenly faced with consequences that couldn't be calculated away. Wilson died within hours. Law was arrested that same day. The charge was murder, not manslaughter, because dueling deaths were prosecuted as deliberate killings under English law. Law's trial happened swiftly, as was common in the 1690s. The jury deliberated briefly before returning a guilty verdict. The sentence, death by hanging. Law's comfortable upbringing hadn't prepared him for Newgate Prison, where condemned prisoners awaited execution in conditions that were brutal even by 17th century standards. Cells were overcrowded, disease-ridden and violently dangerous. Guards supplemented their minimal wages by extorting prisoners for basic necessities like clean water and edible food. Law, accustomed to London's finest establishments, now shared space with common criminals in a building that reeked of human waste and despair. But Law possessed advantages most Newgate prisoners lacked. His family had money, and money could buy privileges even in prison. Better quarters, better food, and most importantly, access to visitors who might arrange assistance. Law's mother, Jean Campbell Law, mobilized family resources to save her son. She hired lawyers to pursue appeals, used social connections to pressure officials, and crucially, arranged the bribery that would ultimately save Law's life. The appeal process revealed technicalities in Law's conviction. Some evidence had been improperly presented, some witnesses inadequately examined. Whether these technicalities were genuinely significant, or whether judges were influenced by discrete payments from the Law family, remains debated by historians. What's certain is that Law's death sentence was commuted to a prison sentence pending further appeals. This reprieve gave Law's supporters time to arrange the next step: escape. Prison escapes weren't uncommon in 17th century England, particularly for wealthy prisoners who could afford to bribe guards. The exact details of Law's escape remain murky. Official records were deliberately vague, suggesting authorities were quietly complicit. On a night in late 1694, John Law simply walked out of prison and disappeared into London's streets. He couldn't remain in England. As an escaped murderer, he faced immediate rearrest and execution if caught. Law fled to the continent, beginning a period of exile that would last over 2 decades. He left behind his family, his property, and any possibility of legitimate life in Britain. At 23, his conventional future had ended abruptly and violently. Yet Law wasn't crushed by these circumstances. His notebooks came with him into exile, filled with his economic theories and mathematical calculations. The gambling skills that had partly caused his downfall would now fund his survival. And the forced separation from Britain's rigid social hierarchies would eventually free him to pursue radical ideas that British authorities would never have tolerated. As Law boarded a ship bound for continental Europe in early 1695, he carried nothing but his mathematical genius, his dangerous charm, and his revolutionary conviction that money itself was merely a collective belief, one that could be reshaped, reimagined, and ultimately controlled by someone clever enough to understand its true nature. Chapter 2: Murder Escape. The morning fog along the Thames created perfect cover as John Law slipped aboard a merchant vessel departing for Rotterdam. He'd shaved his distinctive facial hair, wore plain clothing instead of his usual fashionable attire, and traveled under a false name. Precautions against the arrest warrant that described him in considerable detail. The murder of Edward Wilson had made Law notorious enough that ship captains checking passenger lists might recognize his real name. Discovery meant return to Newgate and the gallows. Rotterdam represented safety but also uncertainty. Law arrived with enough funds to survive comfortably for several months. His mother had managed to convert some of his English assets into portable wealth before his escape. But he couldn't simply live quietly as a fugitive. His personality and ambition wouldn't allow it, and practically speaking, he needed income. The obvious solution was returning to what had caused his troubles in the first place: gambling. Continental Europe's gambling scene operated differently from London's. Amsterdam, Rotterdam, Paris, and Venice all hosted sophisticated gambling establishments where wealthy merchants, aristocrats, and adventurers wagered substantial sums. These weren't backroom operations, but semi-legitimate businesses, often protected by local authorities who received portions of profits. The clientele was international, the stakes were high, and a skilled player with Law's mathematical abilities could earn impressive income. Law established himself quickly on the gambling circuit. His ability to calculate odds gave him consistent edges, but he was also smart enough to avoid winning too consistently or too dramatically. Players who won too often got barred from games or worse, accused of cheating and subjected to violent consequences. Law won steadily but not spectacularly, enough to fund a comfortable lifestyle while maintaining his welcome at various establishments. But gambling was merely income, not purpose. Law's mind remained focused on the economic theories he'd been developing before Wilson's death interrupted everything. Now, moving between European commercial centers, he had unprecedented opportunities to observe different monetary systems in action. Amsterdam's sophisticated banking system fascinated him particularly. The Amsterdam Wisselbank, established in 1609, had created a stable currency system that facilitated the Dutch Republic's commercial dominance. Law studied it carefully, taking notes, asking questions, beginning to formulate more detailed versions of his banking theories. What's interesting is that Law's exile gave him perspectives impossible to gain in England. Britain's economy remained relatively backward compared to Dutch finance. The Bank of England, founded in 1694, just months before Law killed Wilson, was still finding its footing. The Dutch had decades of practical experience with concepts Law was theorizing about: centralized banking, bills of exchange, credit systems that enabled commerce beyond the limits of physical currency. Law didn't just observe, he participated. He began writing detailed proposals for banking and monetary reform, initially addressed to Scottish authorities. Scotland in the 1690s faced severe economic problems. The Darien Scheme, an ambitious attempt to establish a Scottish colony in Panama, was collapsing catastrophically, draining an estimated quarter of Scotland's total liquid capital. The nation desperately needed innovative economic thinking, and Law believed his exile hadn't completely severed his ability to influence his homeland. His first major economic treatise, written around 1700, proposed establishing a land bank in Scotland that would issue paper currency backed by real estate rather than precious metals. The logic was straightforward. Land had stable, productive value, unlike gold and silver whose supply was arbitrarily limited. A currency backed by Scotland's total land value could expand to match economic activity, stimulating trade and development. The Scottish Parliament actually considered Law's proposal seriously for a while, reflecting how desperate Scotland's situation had become. Here's the thing: Law's proposals contained genuine brilliance mixed with dangerous assumptions. His insight that monetary supply needed to expand with economic activity was fundamentally correct. Modern central banks operate on exactly this principle, but his belief that paper currency could be essentially unlimited if properly managed underestimated human psychology and the importance of confidence in monetary systems. Law understood mathematics better than he understood human nature's tendency toward panic. While developing his economic theories, Law was also developing his social network across Europe. His charm, intelligence, and fashionable presence opened doors among continental aristocracy. He became friends with intellectuals, bankers, and government officials. These relationships weren't accidents. Law deliberately cultivated connections with people who might eventually help implement his ideas. He was building toward something, though even he probably didn't fully understand what yet. His personal life during this period showed the same mix of sophistication and recklessness that characterized everything he did. In the early 1700s, Law entered a relationship with Catherine Knowles, another British exile living on the continent. She'd fled England to escape an arranged marriage, which technically made their relationship scandalous, but was typical of expatriate society's loose conventions. They never formally married, but they had 2 children together, John in 1705 and Mary Catherine in 1710, and maintained what appears to have been a genuinely affectionate partnership. Catherine supported Law's ambitions, managed their household during his frequent travels, and provided stability that allowed him to focus on his economic schemes. She also possessed her own intelligence and capability. Managing finances for a fugitive gambler with grandiose plans required considerable skill. Their relationship represented one of the few areas where Law showed consistent responsibility and loyalty. By 1705, Law had been living in exile for a decade. He'd survived as a fugitive, prospered as a gambler, and developed comprehensive economic theories that were gaining limited attention among European intellectuals. He'd also maintained the charisma and confidence that made people listen to him despite his criminal background. He was 34 years old, still ambitious, still convinced his monetary theories could transform nations, still searching for the opportunity to prove it. That opportunity was forming in France, though Law didn't fully recognize it yet. King Louis XIV's endless wars were draining French finances catastrophically. The Sun King's magnificent reign, with its palace at Versailles and its cultural dominance of Europe, rested on increasingly shaky economic foundations. French government debt was accumulating at unsustainable rates. Tax collection was inefficient and corrupt. The monetary system was rigid and inadequate for a nation of France's size and complexity. Law began visiting Paris more frequently, cultivating relationships with French officials and intellectuals, presenting his banking theories to anyone who would listen. Most dismissed him as an interesting eccentric, a charming Scottish gambler with impractical ideas. But a few paid attention, recognizing that France's worsening fiscal crisis might eventually require unconventional solutions. Law couldn't know that Louis XIV's death in 1715 would create the perfect storm of circumstances for his theories to be tested on the grandest possible scale. He couldn't predict that within a few years, he'd control France's entire economy, implementing a financial experiment that would become legendary for both its innovation and its catastrophic collapse. But he was positioning himself, developing his ideas, and waiting for the moment when desperate circumstances would make radical solutions acceptable. The fugitive murderer was about to become the most powerful economic mind in Europe. Chapter 3. Mathematical Genius. John Law's economic theories rested on a fundamental insight that distinguished him from virtually every financial thinker of his era. Money was not wealth itself, but merely a tool for exchanging wealth. This seems obvious to modern economists raised on abstract monetary theory, but in the early 1700s, most people, including most government officials, believed wealth meant accumulating gold and silver. Nations measured their prosperity by how much precious metal they possessed. Economic policy centered on hoarding specie, restricting exports of currency, and jealously guarding mineral resources. Law recognized this was backwards. Real wealth consisted of productive land, skilled labor, manufactured goods, and trade networks. Money simply facilitated transactions among these genuinely valuable things. If a nation had abundant resources but insufficient currency to enable trade, economic activity stagnated not from lack of wealth, but from lack of medium of exchange. It was like having a massive warehouse full of valuable goods, but no system for buyers and sellers to connect. The goods existed, but couldn't create prosperity because they couldn't be efficiently traded. This led Law to his most revolutionary conclusion: paper currency could be superior to metal currency if properly managed. Paper could expand to match economic activity, whereas gold and silver supplies were arbitrarily constrained by mining output. A growing economy needed growing currency supply. Paper money could provide this flexibility that precious metals couldn't. Consider the mathematics that supported Law's thinking. In 1700, France had perhaps 20 million people, and an economy that, if all potential production and trade were realized, could generate enormous wealth. But the total money supply in circulation was constrained by available gold and silver, perhaps 50 million livres worth of actual coin. This meant that even if France's productive capacity could generate 100 million livres worth of economic activity annually, only 50 million livres of actual transactions could occur, because that's all the physical currency available to facilitate them. 50 million livres of potential wealth sat unrealized, not because resources didn't exist, but because insufficient currency prevented trades from happening. Law's solution was elegantly simple: issue paper currency, backed by something stable and valuable other than scarce metals. His initial preference was land. France possessed vast land holdings, forests, farms, aristocratic estates, crown properties. If this land could serve as backing for paper currency, France could issue money supply matching its economic potential rather than being arbitrarily limited by metallic currency supply. You see, Law had calculated that France's total land value far exceeded its precious metal holdings. If the government established a bank that issued paper notes backed by mortgage claims on French land, the currency supply could expand dramatically while maintaining value backing. Landowners could mortgage their properties to the bank, receiving paper notes they could spend in the economy. These notes would circulate as currency, increasing money supply and stimulating trade. The land itself remained productive, generating value, while the paper representation of that land value circulated through the economy, enabling transactions. The mathematical elegance of this system impressed everyone who understood it. What made people nervous was the psychological component. Precious metals had obvious intrinsic value. Gold and silver were physically valuable materials with inherent worth. Land also had intrinsic value, but it wasn't portable. Paper notes representing land value were 3 steps removed from the actual valuable thing. You couldn't eat paper, couldn't make jewelry from it, couldn't use it for any practical purpose except as a claim on something else. The entire system depended on collective confidence that the paper notes really did represent something valuable, and that the bank would really honor its obligations to convert paper back to land or metal if demanded. Law understood this confidence component, but he believed, fatally as it turned out, that confidence could be maintained through proper management and government authority. If the bank maintained sufficient reserves, managed note issuance carefully, and had government backing, people would accept paper currency. After all, people already accepted bills of exchange and promissory notes in commercial transactions. Law's system just formalized and expanded this existing practice. His mathematical calculations showed how dramatically paper currency could stimulate economic growth. If France's money supply doubled, transaction volume could potentially double, meaning more trade, more employment, more production, and ultimately more tax revenue for the government. The increased economic activity would generate real wealth, not just inflated numbers, but actual increases in goods produced, services rendered, and living standards improved. Law genuinely believed his system would make France dramatically more prosperous. What most people miss is that Law also understood risk. His notebooks from this period show calculations about optimal reserve ratios, maximum safe issuance levels, and mechanisms for managing currency redemption demands. He wasn't naive about the dangers of overissuance. He simply believed that intelligent management could navigate these dangers successfully. Law spent years refining his theories, incorporating observations from his travels across Europe. He studied Amsterdam's banking system intensively, analyzing how the Whistle Bank maintained confidence while facilitating massive transaction volumes. He examined Venice's sophisticated financial instruments, Stockholm's early experiments with paper currency, and London's nascent development of government bonds and national banking. He synthesized these observations with his theoretical framework, creating what he believed was a comprehensive system for modern monetary management. His major written work, Money and Trade Considered, composed around 1705, laid out his complete theory. The treatise argued that increasing money supply would lower interest rates, stimulate investment, expand employment, and generate prosperity. It proposed specific mechanisms for implementing land-backed paper currency. It addressed objections about inflation and currency stability. The document was ambitious, detailed, and fundamentally visionary, but it was also dangerously incomplete. Law's mathematical models assumed rational behavior, stable confidence, and competent management. They didn't adequately account for speculative manias, panic dynamics, or the political pressures that would inevitably influence any real-world implementation of his system. Law had designed a sophisticated machine that would work beautifully if every component functioned perfectly, but could catastrophically fail if any piece broke down. The truth is, Law's brilliance was genuine but unbalanced. His mathematical ability was extraordinary. He could perform complex calculations mentally that would require hours for ordinary people working with pen and paper. His theoretical insights were decades ahead of contemporary economic thinking, but his understanding of human psychology, while sophisticated for his era, wasn't sufficient for the system he was proposing. He believed people would behave rationally in their economic self-interest. History would prove that when speculation fever took hold, rationality disappeared entirely. By 1710, Law was 40 years old, still in exile, still promoting his theories to anyone who would listen. He'd achieved modest success as a gambler and gained respect in intellectual circles as an innovative economic thinker. But he hadn't found the opportunity to implement his ideas. That required access to government power, which required a nation desperate enough to consider radical solutions. France was becoming that desperate nation. Louis XIV's War of Spanish Succession had been dragging on since 1701, consuming enormous resources. French government debt had ballooned to truly alarming levels. Tax collection couldn't keep pace with spending. The financial system was increasingly dysfunctional, and Louis XIV, now in his 70s, was finally acknowledging that his magnificent reign had left France with serious economic problems. Law couldn't have planned the perfect set of circumstances, but they were forming regardless. Within 5 years, those circumstances would give him the opportunity he'd been waiting for his entire adult life. The mathematical genius who'd killed a man over gambling debts was about to be handed control of Europe's largest economy. The question wasn't whether he understood the mathematics. He absolutely did. The question was whether mathematics alone could control the psychological forces his system would unleash. Chapter 4: Royal Approval. September 1st, 1715. Louis XIV died at Versailles after 72 years on the throne, the longest reign in European royal history. His death created a power vacuum that would reshape French politics and ultimately give John Law his opportunity. The new king, Louis XV, was only 5 years old, far too young to rule. The kingdom required a regent, and the closest eligible relative was Philippe II, Duke of Orléans, Louis XIV's nephew. Philippe d'Orléans was 41 years old, intelligent, cultured, and chronically underestimated. Louis XIV had deliberately excluded him from power, never quite trusting Philippe's independent mind and irreverent personality. Now, suddenly, Philippe controlled France during what promised to be a lengthy minority regency. He faced immediate, catastrophic problems. The most urgent was financial. France was essentially bankrupt. The numbers were staggering. French government debt totaled approximately 3 billion livres, roughly equivalent to 50 years of tax revenue at current collection rates. Annual debt service consumed more than half of all government income before a single soldier was paid, a single road was maintained, or a single government official received salary. The previous regime's solution had been issuing more debt, debasing currency, and implementing increasingly oppressive taxation. None of this was sustainable. Philippe needed solutions. Fast and conventional approaches had already failed. Law had been positioning himself for exactly this moment. He'd cultivated relationships with several of Philippe's close advisors during his frequent visits to Paris. He'd presented his banking theories in salons and discussions, building reputation as an innovative thinker, willing to propose radical solutions. When Philippe became regent, Law was already on the periphery of the new government's consciousness, not a prominent figure, but not completely unknown either. Within months of Louis XIV's death, Law secured a meeting with Philippe d'Orléans. The exact details of their first encounter vary in historical accounts, but the outcome is clear. Philippe was impressed. Law combined mathematical sophistication with persuasive charm. He didn't just propose theories, he offered a comprehensive solution to France's fiscal nightmare. More importantly, he promised something Philippe desperately needed, a way to escape the debt trap without defaulting, which would destroy France's credit, or raising taxes further, which would provoke rebellion. Law's pitch was straightforward. Establish a national bank that would issue paper currency, use this currency to purchase government debt at discount prices, and stimulate economic growth that would generate tax revenues to eventually retire the debt. The bank would operate as a profit-making institution, generating returns for investors while simultaneously serving national economic interests. It was banking, debt restructuring, and economic stimulus combined into one comprehensive system. Philippe faced opposition from traditional financial interests. France's existing financial establishment, the tax farmers who collected revenues, the money changers who handled currency exchange, the merchant bankers who financed trade, all viewed Law's proposals as threats to their profitable operations. They warned Philippe that paper currency was dangerous, that Law was a reckless gambler and convicted murderer, that his theories were untested fantasies that would destroy what remained of French financial stability. But Philippe was desperate enough and independent-minded enough to ignore these warnings. In May 1716, he granted Law permission to establish a private bank, the Banque Générale. This wasn't yet the national bank Law ultimately wanted, but it was a start. The bank would issue paper notes backed by capital subscriptions and by the bank's promise to redeem notes for silver coin on demand. Crucially, Philippe decreed that these notes could be used to pay taxes, giving them government backing and ensuring demand. Law's Banque Générale opened with capital of 6 million livres, raised from wealthy investors willing to gamble on Law's theories and Philippe's patronage. The bank issued paper notes in various denominations, carefully maintaining reserves to meet redemption demands. Law managed the institution conservatively at first, conscious that one mistake could destroy the fragile confidence his system required. The bank's early performance exceeded expectations. Law's paper notes became genuinely popular. They offered significant advantages over coins, easier to transport, easier to count, less vulnerable to clipping or counterfeiting. Merchants discovered that keeping accounts in paper was more efficient than moving heavy bags of silver around. The notes held their value because the bank maintained disciplined redemption practices and because tax acceptance created guaranteed demand. Within a year, the Banque Générale's notes were trading at a premium to the silver they represented. People actually valued the convenience of paper so highly they'd pay slightly more than face value to obtain notes. This was precisely the confidence-building success Law needed. He'd proven that paper currency could work, that people would accept it, and that properly managed banking could serve both private profit and public benefit. Philippe noticed this success. France's government finances remained disastrous, but Law had demonstrated competence and innovation. The regent began consulting Law more frequently, inviting him to policy discussions, treating him as a trusted economic advisor. The convicted murderer who'd arrived in Paris as an exiled gambler was becoming a power player in the French court. Look, Law's growing influence generated intense controversy. Aristocrats resented this Scottish upstart's access to the regent. Traditional financiers felt threatened by his innovative methods. Some critics questioned Philippe's judgment in elevating a foreigner with a criminal past to positions of influence. But Philippe, who'd spent years being underestimated by his uncle Louis XIV, seemed to enjoy defying convention and backing the unconventional Law against establishment criticism. The crucial turning point came in 1717. Law proposed converting his private Banque Générale into a state institution, the Banque Royale, directly backed by government authority. He also proposed something far more ambitious, establishing a monopoly trading company that would control all French commerce with North America's Mississippi River Valley and Louisiana Territory. This company would absorb portions of government debt in exchange for exclusive trading rights, combining commercial enterprise with fiscal restructuring. Philippe approved both proposals. In December 1717, the Banque Générale became the Banque Royale, and Law received authorization to establish the Compagnie d'Occident, the Company of the West, with exclusive rights to Louisiana trade. Law now controlled both France's currency issuance and a major trading monopoly. The power consolidation was breathtaking in its scope and speed. What's interesting is that Law's ambitions were genuinely patriotic, at least partly. He wasn't simply enriching himself, though he certainly did that. He genuinely believed his system would transform France into Europe's dominant economic power. He envisioned Louisiana developing into enormously profitable colonies, generating wealth that would flow back to France, enriching investors and strengthening the kingdom. He saw paper currency as liberating French economic potential that rigid metallic currency had constrained. He was empire building, but he was also implementing what he believed was sound economic policy. The opposition knew they were losing ground. By early 1718, Law controlled mechanisms that threatened to make traditional financiers obsolete. If his bank successfully managed currency and his company successfully managed colonial trade, what role remained for the tax farmers, money changers, and merchant bankers who dominated French finance? They mounted fierce resistance, lobbying Philippe's other advisors, spreading rumors about Law's past, predicting catastrophe from his innovations. But Philippe's support remained solid. The regent had bet his political credibility on Law's success, and crucially, Law was delivering results. The Banque Royale was functioning smoothly. The Compagnie d'Occident was raising capital successfully. France's debt service costs were declining as Law's companies absorbed government obligations at discounted rates. The fiscal situation, while still dire, seemed finally to be moving in a positive direction after years of deterioration. By 1718, 3 years after Philippe became regent, and 2 years after Law established his first bank, the Scottish gambler had achieved a position of power that would have seemed impossibly unlikely during his years wandering Europe as a fugitive. He had the regent's ear, control of national banking, monopoly over colonial trade, and growing wealth from his successful ventures. He also had something dangerous: momentum. Success was generating more success, creating positive feedback loops that seemed to validate his theories completely. Investors were making money. The government was managing its debt more effectively. Economic activity was increasing. Every positive result strengthened confidence in Law's system and created pressure to expand it further. The mathematical genius had royal approval. The revolutionary theories were becoming reality. The system was working. But the system was also creating the exact conditions that would ultimately destroy it. Excessive confidence, unchecked expansion, and the belief that paper wealth was indistinguishable from real wealth. The seeds of catastrophe were already planted, even as everyone celebrated the success. Chapter 5: Banking Revolution. By January 1719, John Law wasn't just managing a bank and a trading company, he was revolutionizing how France understood money itself. The Banque Royale had become essential to French commerce, its paper notes circulating throughout the kingdom as the preferred medium for significant transactions. Law had solved a problem that had plagued France for decades: insufficient currency supply for the economy's needs. Merchants who'd previously struggled to conduct business because moving large quantities of silver coins was cumbersome and dangerous, now completed transactions effortlessly with paper notes. The transformation was genuine. In Paris, commercial activity increased measurably. More goods moved through markets. More construction projects received financing. More businesses expanded operations. Law's critics had predicted that paper currency would drive out precious metals through Gresham's law, the principle that bad money drives out good money. But the opposite happened. People preferred paper for its convenience while keeping some metal for security. The dual system worked smoothly, with paper handling most transaction volume while metal remained as ultimate backing. Law's Compagnie d'Occident was simultaneously capturing French imagination with visions of Louisiana's supposedly unlimited potential. Law commissioned publications describing Louisiana as a paradise of fertile land, abundant resources, and willing native populations ready to trade. The Mississippi River Valley, these promotional materials claimed, would become France's answer to Spain's South American silver mines, an inexhaustible source of wealth flowing back to enrich the mother country. The reality of Louisiana was considerably grimmer. The territory was sparsely populated by French settlers, many of whom had been forcibly transported as convicts or desperately poor volunteers lured by false promises. The climate was harsh, disease was rampant, and relations with Native American populations were complicated and often hostile. The colony produced modest amounts of tobacco and some fur trade, but nothing remotely justifying the spectacular claims in Law's promotional literature. But here's what made Law's system dangerous. The actual performance of Louisiana was increasingly irrelevant to the company's stock price. Investors weren't buying shares based on careful analysis of colonial production figures. They were buying because share prices kept rising, because everyone else was buying, and because Law himself, eloquent, confident, mathematically sophisticated, kept promising that spectacular returns were coming soon. In May 1719, Law executed a brilliant and risky maneuver. He absorbed several other French trading monopolies into his company. The Compagnie d'Occident merged with the Compagnie des Indes Orientales, East Indies Company, the Compagnie de Chine, China Company, and others, creating a comprehensive entity eventually known as the Compagnie des Indes. This consolidated company now controlled virtually all of France's overseas trade, from North America to Africa to Asia. It was an unprecedented commercial monopoly, backed by government authority and controlled by one man. Law used this consolidated monopoly to absorb more government debt. The company would assume government obligations, bonds paying interest to holders, in exchange for maintaining its exclusive trading rights. Debt holders could convert their government bonds into company shares. This conversion served multiple purposes. It reduced government debt service costs, it provided debt holders with potentially profitable equity instead of slowly eroding bonds, and it created massive demand for company shares. The mechanics of this debt-equity conversion created powerful psychological effects. Government bonds had been trading at steep discounts. A 1,000-livre bond might sell for only 500 livres because investors doubted the government would ever fully repay. Law offered to accept these bonds at face value for company shares. This meant an investor holding a 1,000-livre bond worth 500 livres in the market could convert it to 1,000 livres worth of company shares. This was instant profit, assuming the shares maintained value, and share prices were rising rapidly. Think about it. You're a French aristocrat holding 50,000 livres in government bonds that you'd feared were nearly worthless. Suddenly, Law offers to convert them to shares in a company that's supposedly going to generate massive profits from global trade monopolies. Share prices are rising weekly. Everyone around you is converting and getting rich. The decision seems obvious. By summer 1719, conversion demand was overwhelming. Thousands of investors lined up at the company's offices to exchange bonds for shares. Law conducted multiple share issuances to meet demand, each subscription oversubscribed within hours. Share prices kept rising, which generated more demand, which pushed prices higher still. A positive feedback loop was accelerating out of control. Law was printing shares the way his bank printed currency, creating paper representations of value faster than underlying real value could possibly grow. But few people noticed or cared because paper values kept increasing. The share price climbed from 500 livres to 1,000 livres to 3,000 livres to 5,000 livres. Fortunes were being made weekly. A modest investor who'd purchased shares in early 1719 saw their investment increase tenfold by autumn. This wealth effect transformed Parisian society. The word millionaire was coined during this period. So many people were suddenly claiming net worth exceeding 1,000,000 livres that a new term was needed to describe them. Servants quit working for aristocrats because they'd made fortunes buying shares. Craftsmen abandoned shops because stock speculation paid better than actual production. The Rue Quincampoix, where trading occurred, became so crowded that Philippe had to deploy soldiers to manage the chaos. Law himself was becoming unimaginably wealthy and powerful. His personal shares were worth hundreds of millions of livres. His influence over French policy was nearly absolute. Philippe consulted him on virtually every major economic decision. In January 1720, Law's power reached its apex. Philippe appointed him Controller General of Finances, making him effectively Prime Minister for Economic Affairs. The Scottish fugitive now held France's highest financial office. The scope of Law's control by early 1720 was extraordinary. He ran the Banque Royale, which issued all French paper currency. He controlled the Compagnie des Indes, which monopolized overseas trade. He managed the General Tax Farm, which collected most government revenues. He directed the National Mint, controlling coin production. He set monetary policy, fiscal policy, and trade policy simultaneously. No individual in French history had ever concentrated such comprehensive economic power. Look, Law was attempting something genuinely revolutionary, integrating banking, trade, taxation, and monetary policy into one coordinated system aimed at national prosperity. Modern economists would recognize this as early macroeconomic management, using government and quasi-government institutions to guide overall economic performance. The theory was sophisticated and ahead of its time. The execution was beginning to unravel. The fundamental problem was that Law's system had three separate components that needed to work together. The bank needed to maintain currency stability, the trading company needed to generate real profits, and the government needed to use reduced debt costs to achieve fiscal balance. But all three were failing simultaneously, hidden temporarily by rising paper values that created illusion of success. The bank was issuing currency far beyond its reserve capacity. By early 1720, the Banque Royale had paper notes outstanding worth roughly twice the total coinage in France, and the actual silver reserves backing these notes were a small fraction of note volume. The system worked only as long as note holders didn't simultaneously demand redemption. If confidence broke, if people rushed to convert paper to metal, the bank couldn't possibly honor all claims. The trading company wasn't generating anywhere near the profits needed to justify its share price. Louisiana remained unproductive. The other trading monopolies produced modest profits, but nothing remotely matching investor expectations. The company's actual value was probably 1/10 of its market capitalization. The share price was sustained purely by speculation and new money flowing in, not by underlying business performance. The government was using its temporary debt relief not to achieve fiscal balance but to increase spending. Felipe's court expenses were rising, military costs remained high, and bureaucratic reforms needed to make tax collection more efficient weren't being implemented. The breathing room laws system provided was being squandered rather than used to address fundamental fiscal problems. Law recognized some of these dangers. His private correspondence shows growing concerns about speculation's intensity and warnings about share price sustainability, but he was trapped by his own success. The system required confidence, and maintaining confidence required continued paper value increases, which required ever greater note issuance and share creation. Stopping the machine would crash it, but running it faster was making eventual crash more devastating. By March 1720, law controlled everything and was losing control of everything simultaneously. The banking revolution he'd engineered was succeeding beyond imagination and creating the preconditions for its catastrophic failure. Paper wealth was accumulating at rates that couldn't possibly reflect real economic growth. Speculation had replaced production as France's primary economic activity. The question wasn't whether the system would crash. The question was what would trigger the crash and how bad the damage would be. Law was about to find out, and the answer would be worse than even his mathematical genius could have calculated. Chapter 6. Mississippi Madness. The transformation of Rue Quincampoix into Europe's most frenzied financial market happened with stunning speed. By spring 1720, this narrow Parisian street had become ground zero for a speculative mania that was reshaping French society in bizarre and ultimately catastrophic ways. Thousands of people crowded the street daily, trading shares in Law's Compagnie des Indes at prices that bore no relationship to economic reality. Contemporary accounts describe scenes of absolute chaos. Aristocrats, merchants, servants, soldiers, and clergy all crushed together, shouting bids and offers, negotiating deals, celebrating sudden fortunes. A hunchbacked man famously rented out his back as a writing desk for traders to sign contracts, earning enough to retire wealthy. Buildings facing the street rented window space and balconies to traders at exorbitant prices. Coffee shops became informal trading floors. The street had to be closed to vehicle traffic because human density made passage impossible. The share price had lost all connection to the company's actual operations. Compagnie des Indes shares had started 1719 at 500 livres. By May 1720, they'd reached 10,000 livres, a 20-fold increase in 16 months. The company's supposed profits from Louisiana trade couldn't possibly justify this valuation. Louisiana was producing minimal returns, some tobacco, some furs, nothing remotely matching investor expectations. Yet share prices kept climbing because new buyers kept appearing, each convinced they'd profit by selling to the next wave of speculators. This was a classic financial bubble, perhaps the most spectacular in European history to that point. The psychology driving it was transparent. People weren't buying shares as investments in a trading company, but as lottery tickets they expected to resell at higher prices. Everyone knew share prices couldn't rise forever, but everyone believed they'd exit before the crash. The mathematics made no sense, but greed and euphoria overwhelmed rational calculation. Law watched this mania with growing alarm. He'd created the system, but he no longer controlled it. The speculation had taken on momentum independent of his intentions. His initial vision, using paper currency and joint stock companies to mobilize France's economic potential, had mutated into pure speculation, divorced from productive activity. He'd unleashed forces he didn't fully understand and couldn't manage, yet Law was trapped. His entire system depended on confidence, and confidence required rising share prices. If prices fell, if speculation reversed, the cascade of failures would be immediate and devastating. The Compagnie des Indes shares served as collateral for bank loans, as reserves backing currency issuance, and as psychological foundation for the entire financial structure. If share prices collapsed, everything collapsed. Law attempted to manage the speculation carefully. He implemented regulations limiting price increases to 2% monthly. He restricted trading hours. He required transactions to be registered. These measures proved completely ineffective. Speculators simply ignored rules or found workarounds. Black markets developed where shares traded at prices exceeding official limits. The mania was beyond regulatory control. What's interesting is that some sophisticated observers recognized the bubble for what it was. Richard Cantillon, an Irish-French banker, made enormous profits by buying shares early and selling near the peak, then taking his profits out of France entirely. He understood that Law's system was unsustainable and that paper wealth would eventually prove worthless. But Cantillon represented a small minority. Most people, including many who should have known better, believed the boom would continue indefinitely. The speculation created bizarre social effects. Traditional status hierarchies inverted temporarily, as suddenly wealthy speculators flaunted riches exceeding ancient noble families. Coachmen who'd bought shares early retired with fortunes, leaving aristocrats unable to find servants. The word millionaire stopped being impressive because too many people qualified. Economic activity beyond speculation nearly stopped. Why work when trading shares paid better? Law's response to this chaos showed both his brilliance and his fatal weakness. In theory, he understood that speculation needed to be controlled, but practically, every action he considered would puncture the bubble he'd created. He was like a juggler who'd added too many objects and now couldn't stop without dropping everything. His only option was continuing to juggle faster, hoping somehow to gracefully reduce complexity without catastrophic failure. By May 1720, the system's instability had become undeniable. Several wealthy investors, sensing danger, began converting shares to metal currency and moving wealth abroad. Law couldn't allow this. If large-scale conversion from paper to metal began, the bank would quickly exhaust reserves, note redemption would fail, and confidence would evaporate. He needed to stop the exit without triggering panic that would accelerate it. Law made a fateful decision. He implemented restrictions on precious metal ownership and export. Citizens couldn't legally possess more than 500 livres in coin. Metal couldn't be transported outside France without special permission. These measures aimed to force people to keep wealth in paper form, preventing the reserve drain that would crash the system. The reaction was immediate and negative. Wealthy families who'd accumulated fortunes, whether through speculation or traditional means, now faced government restrictions on converting paper to metal. This was explicitly what Law had promised wouldn't happen, that paper would always be convertible to metal on demand. Breaking that promise destroyed the psychological foundation of confidence his system required. Look, these restrictions fundamentally altered the nature of Law's currency. Paper notes that couldn't be reliably converted to metal weren't really money. They were forced circulation certificates with questionable value. The market immediately recognized this distinction. Paper notes began trading at discounts to their face value. People who needed to complete transactions demanded extra paper to compensate for its declining credibility. Law tried to stabilize the situation through forced measures. He decreed that his banknotes were the only legal currency for transactions above certain amounts. He mandated share price levels. Shares must trade at 9,000 livres, he insisted, fixing prices by government authority. He attempted to jawbone confidence back into existence through sheer force of will and state power. None of this worked. Markets don't respond to decrees when underlying fundamentals are obviously unsound. By June 1720, the panic Law had tried desperately to prevent was beginning. Share prices were falling despite official price targets. Note values were declining despite legal tender laws. Wealthy individuals were fleeing France entirely, taking whatever portable wealth they could manage past increasingly strict currency controls. The speculation that had dominated Parisian life for months reversed with shocking speed. The same people who'd crowded Rue Quincampoix celebrating paper fortunes now gathered demanding their money back, wanting metal, wanting something real instead of increasingly questionable paper. The transition from mania to panic took mere weeks. Law's response showed him at his worst, denying reality, implementing increasingly desperate controls, believing that proper management could overcome the fundamental insolvency of his system. He'd convinced himself so thoroughly that paper currency represented monetary progress that he couldn't acknowledge that uncontrolled issuance had destroyed the currency's credibility. The Mississippi Madness was ending. The reckoning was beginning, and the reckoning would be absolutely brutal. Chapter 7. Paper Empire. July 1720. The Banque Royale faced a run. Thousands of Parisians lined up outside the bank's offices, many having waited overnight, demanding to convert paper notes to silver coin as the bank's founding charter promised. Law had issued paper worth approximately 2 billion livres, backed by silver reserves of perhaps 70 million, a ratio of 30-to-1 paper to metal. The arithmetic was simple and fatal. The bank couldn't honor redemption demands for more than a tiny fraction of outstanding notes. Law implemented a ruthless solution. He simply closed the bank for conversion. Paper notes were still supposedly legal tender, still required for tax payments, still officially valuable. They just couldn't be exchanged for metal anymore. This was de facto default disguised as temporary suspension. The paper empire Law had constructed was revealing itself as exactly that, paper, with nothing substantial underneath. The social chaos was immediate. Families that had converted their life savings into paper notes now held what they increasingly recognized as worthless documents. The aristocrats who'd exchanged government bonds for Compagnie des Indes shares watched those shares lose value daily. The servants and craftsmen who'd quit working to speculate full-time now had neither employment nor savings. The millionaires created by speculation discovered that their millions were denominated in a currency that nobody wanted. Law attempted price controls to stabilize the collapse. He issued decrees specifying official exchange rates between paper and metal, between shares and currency, between various forms of his increasingly complex paper instruments. The decrees were ignored. Black markets flourished where desperate people traded paper assets at discounts up to 90% below face value. A 10,000 livre note might fetch 1,000 livres in actual silver if you could find anyone willing to buy paper at any price. The Compagnie des Indes, the supposed profit-generating engine behind Law's system, was exposed as essentially worthless. Louisiana wasn't producing significant revenue. The other trading monopolies generated modest profits, but nothing justifying the astronomical valuations investors had accepted during the mania. The company's actual asset value was probably 1/20th of the peak share price. Shareholders had purchased vastly overpriced equity in an underperforming conglomerate. What nobody had fully grasped during the boom was that Law had created a circular system where each component's value depended on the others. The bank's notes were valuable because they could purchase company shares. Company shares were valuable because bank credit could finance purchases. Government debt had been converted to shares whose value was backed by banknotes, whose value was backed by government promises. The whole structure was internally self-referential with no solid foundation. When confidence broke at any point, the entire circuit collapsed. Law's personal situation grew dangerous. Popular rage focused on him as the architect of disaster. Crowds gathered outside his residence shouting threats. People who'd lost their savings demanded his arrest, execution, exile, anything to punish the man they blamed for their ruin. Philippe assigned guards to protect Law, but even the regent's support was wavering as political pressure mounted. You see, Law had made the classic mistake of confusing paper wealth with real wealth. During the boom, as share prices climbed and note issuance expanded, France appeared dramatically wealthier. But this was a counting illusion. The nation's actual productive capacity, its farms, workshops, mines, labor force, hadn't changed significantly. What had changed was the quantity of paper claims on that productive capacity. When reality reasserted itself, when people recognized that paper didn't represent proportional real assets, the paper values evaporated. The economic damage extended beyond financial losses. Trade disrupted because nobody trusted the currency. Merchants refused payment in paper notes, but coin was scarce. International commerce virtually stopped because foreign traders wouldn't accept French paper. Tax collection collapsed because nobody wanted to hold currency long enough to pay taxes. The economy was seizing up, reverting to barter in some regions because the monetary system had failed so completely. Law tried desperate measures to restore functionality. He proposed new banking systems with better reserve ratios. He offered to resign if that would help restore confidence. He suggested gradual currency reforms that might rebuild credibility over time. Philippe, facing political crisis as fury over the financial disaster spread, had stopped listening. The regent needed a scapegoat, and Law was the obvious choice. In May 1720, Law had been France's most powerful official, controlling banking, trade, taxation, and monetary policy. By August, he was powerless. Philippe removed him as Controller General in May. The bank's authority was stripped in August. His personal safety became questionable as popular rage intensified. The fallen financial genius was becoming a hunted fugitive again, just like after killing Wilson a quarter-century earlier. The comparison was apt. Law had gambled, not with cards this time, but with an entire kingdom's economy, and he'd lost catastrophically. His mathematical brilliance, his theoretical insights, his persuasive charm had all proven insufficient when confronted with the psychological realities of speculative manias and subsequent panics. He'd believed rational management could control irrational behavior. He'd been wrong. Look, Law wasn't entirely cynical. His correspondence and private papers show he genuinely believed his system would work, that paper currency would liberate economic potential, that his innovations would make France prosperous. He'd been tragically expensively sincere in his errors. A pure fraud would have extracted wealth and fled early. Law had stayed, kept trying to fix the problems, kept believing he could engineer recovery through clever policy adjustments. His sincerity made the disaster more poignant but no less catastrophic. By December 1720, Law's situation had become untenable. Death threats were constant. His guards couldn't guarantee safety indefinitely. Philippe, while not actively persecuting Law, couldn't protect him against popular fury. Law made arrangements to flee France, abandoning the country where he'd achieved unprecedented power and engineered unprecedented disaster. The wealth he'd accumulated during the boom evaporated with the system's collapse. The shares that had been worth hundreds of millions were worthless paper. The properties he'd purchased were seized to partially compensate victims. Law left France with modest funds, enough to survive in exile but nothing resembling the fortune he'd temporarily possessed. The paper empire had vaporized completely. On December 14, 1720, Law departed Paris disguised as an ordinary traveler, accompanied only by his son. Catherine and their daughter had left earlier through different routes to avoid attention. The family was scattering into exile again, just as Law had done after killing Wilson, except this time he was fleeing not one murder but the financial devastation of thousands. As Law's carriage rolled away from Paris, he left behind a kingdom economically shattered. Government debt was worse than before his interventions. Converting to shares hadn't eliminated obligations, merely transformed them. The currency system was chaotic. Trade was disrupted. Political stability was threatened. France's economy had been severely damaged, and recovery would require years. The paper empire had been ambitious, innovative, revolutionary, and completely unsustainable. Law had been building a castle in the air, and gravity had finally asserted itself. The wreckage of his schemes would take decades to fully clear away. Chapter 8: Crushing Reality. The human cost of the Mississippi bubble's collapse extended far beyond financial statistics. Thousands of families faced absolute ruin. Consider a typical case: a minor nobleman who'd inherited estates producing modest annual income. Convinced by Law's propaganda and the spectacular returns others were achieving, He mortgaged his properties to purchase Compagnie des Indes shares at peak prices. When share values collapsed, he lost both his leveraged investment and the estates securing the debt. The family went from comfortable aristocratic life to genuine poverty within months. Similar stories played out across French society. Merchants who'd converted working capital to shares now lacked funds to purchase inventory. Craftsmen who'd quit their trades to speculate full-time had neither savings nor current employment. Widows who'd held government bonds, considered safe conservative investments, had exchanged them for shares that were now worthless. The financial disaster didn't discriminate. It destroyed wealth across all social classes. The psychological impact was profound. People had believed Law's promises that paper currency represented financial progress, that shares in the company offered legitimate investment opportunity, that government backing made the system secure. These beliefs had proven false, and the betrayal generated not just anger, but deep cynicism about government, banking, and paper instruments generally. France's collective trust in financial innovation was shattered for generations. Law's system also created winners, though they were fewer and quieter than the losers. Richard Cantillon, mentioned earlier, made enormous profits through careful timing. Several aristocratic families with good political intelligence sold shares early and moved wealth abroad. Some foreign investors, particularly British and Dutch bankers, extracted profits before the collapse. But these successes were exceptions. The vast majority of participants lost money, with losses concentrated among those who'd entered the speculation late or held positions too long. The political consequences threatened the regency itself. Philippe d'Orléans faced intense criticism for supporting Law, for granting him unprecedented authority, for allowing the system to expand unchecked. Opposition nobles who'd always resented Philippe's unconventional approach now had powerful ammunition. Popular protests erupted periodically throughout 1721 as the economic pain persisted. Philippe's position was secure enough to survive, but his reputation suffered permanent damage. The French government faced the fiscal crisis Law was supposed to have solved, except conditions were actually worse. Government debt remained enormous. The conversion of bonds to shares hadn't eliminated obligations. It had merely created confusion about who owned what and what was owed. Tax collection was chaotic because the currency system's breakdown made assessing and collecting revenues extremely difficult. France's fiscal situation in 1721 was arguably more desperate than it had been when Philippe granted Law permission to establish his bank 5 years earlier. Economic recovery happened slowly and painfully. The government eventually restored metallic currency as the primary medium of exchange, abandoning Law's paper currency system entirely. This restored stability, but couldn't restore lost wealth. Commerce gradually resumed as currency trust returned, but trading volumes remained depressed for years. Investment dried up. Who would risk capital in financial instruments after the Mississippi disaster? France's economy grew sluggishly through the 1720s, held back by capital scarcity and persistent distrust of banking innovations. International consequences rippled beyond France. Britain experienced its own simultaneous bubble in the South Sea Company, which collapsed in September 1720, just months after Law's system failed. The parallels were obvious. Both involved government debt conversion to equity in trading companies with monopoly rights. Both featured spectacular speculation. Both collapsed devastatingly. The dual crises generated Europe-wide skepticism about joint stock companies and paper finance. Think about it. The two most sophisticated European economies had both attempted similar financial innovations and both suffered catastrophic results within months of each other. The lesson observers drew wasn't subtle. Paper finance was dangerous, speculation needed strict control, and traditional banking based on precious metals while limiting economic growth was safer than innovative but unstable alternatives. For John Law personally, the years after fleeing France were bitter. He wandered Europe again, much as he had after killing Wilson, but circumstances were different. He was older, infamous rather than merely criminal, and no longer possessed the confident charm that had won him influence 3 decades earlier. The mathematical genius who'd controlled France's economy was reduced to modest gambling income and the charity of former associates. Law attempted to rehabilitate his reputation through writing. He composed detailed defenses of his theories, explanations of what went wrong, proposals for how his system could have worked if implemented differently. These writings showed he still believed his fundamental insights were correct, that paper currency was superior to metallic currency, that credit expansion could stimulate growth, that banking innovation offered genuine benefits. He blamed the disaster on mismanagement and excessive speculation, not flawed theory. This self-assessment was partly justified and partly delusional. Law's theoretical insights were genuinely sophisticated. His recognition that money supply needed to match economic activity was fundamentally correct. His understanding of credit's productive potential was ahead of his time, but his faith in management's ability to control speculation and maintain confidence was naive. He'd underestimated human psychology's tendency toward manias and panics. His brilliance didn't extend to understanding the emotional dynamics that would ultimately destroy his system. Catherine remained with Law through these difficult years, maintaining the family despite financial hardship and social disgrace. Their relationship, which had begun scandalously when both were exiles avoiding conventional society, proved more durable than Law's financial innovations. She managed their household, corresponded with contacts who might provide assistance, and supported Law's increasingly futile attempts to clear his name. The truth was that Europe had moved on. Law's moment had passed. The brief period when his ideas seemed revolutionary and his implementation seemed successful was over. The catastrophic failure had overwhelmed the genuine innovations, and Law became synonymous with financial disaster rather than monetary progress. By the mid-1720s, Law was living in Venice, far from political power, far from financial influence, surviving on modest means. Venice tolerated him partly because he wasn't controversial there. His disasters had been France's problem, and partly because he still possessed some mathematical reputation among Italian intellectuals. He spent his final years gambling modestly, writing defenses of his theories that few people read, and reflecting on how close he'd come to transforming European economics before it all collapsed. In March 1729, John Law died in Venice at age 58. The death was barely noticed across Europe. He'd been irrelevant for nearly a decade, his moment of power a fading memory, overshadowed by its disastrous conclusion. He was buried in Venice's church of San Moise, a minor ceremony for someone who'd once controlled the finances of Europe's largest kingdom. The crushing reality was that Law's failure became his legacy. The innovative theories, the sophisticated mathematical insights, the genuine attempts at economic reform, all were overwhelmed by the spectacular crash. For the next century, Law and Mississippi system became synonymous with reckless speculation and financial disaster. The warnings were passed down through generations. Remember John Law? Remember what happens when paper money isn't properly controlled. Remember that financial innovation can destroy as readily as it creates wealth. Chapter 9. Desperate measures. The period between summer 1720 and Law's final departure from France in December represented his most frantic attempts to salvage the collapsing system. These desperate measures, implemented as confidence evaporated and panic intensified, showed Law at his most ruthless and revealed the authoritarian impulses latent in his theoretical framework. When voluntary confidence failed, Law attempted to impose mandatory confidence through state power, with predictably disastrous results. In June 1720, facing accelerating redemption demands that would exhaust the Banque Royale's precious metal reserves, Law proposed an extraordinary solution: devaluing both the currency and company shares simultaneously by 50%. The logic was straightforward. If notes and shares were both cut in half, their relative values would remain constant, while the bank's reserve ratio would effectively double. A bank with 70 million livres in reserves backing 140 million livres in notes at new values would have a much healthier 2-to-1 ratio instead of the previous 20-to-1. This decree, issued on May 21, 1720, represented financial suicide disguised as policy. Law was explicitly announcing that paper values were arbitrary and subject to government manipulation. The psychological impact was devastating. If the government could decree that a 1,000 livre note was now worth 500 livres, What security did paper assets offer? The measure intended to stabilize the system instead accelerated its collapse by destroying the remaining confidence it required. Popular outrage forced Philippe to rescind the devaluation decree within days, the only time the regent explicitly overruled law on major policy. But the damage was done. Everyone now understood that paper values weren't secure, that government promises could be arbitrarily revised, that law's entire system rested on foundations that could shift without warning. The attempted devaluation, even though withdrawn, effectively announced the system's bankruptcy. Law tried alternative approaches. He implemented mandatory acceptance regulations, requiring merchants to accept banknotes at face value for all transactions. Refusal to accept notes became legally punishable. This transformed paper money from voluntary medium of exchange to forced circulation government decree. Markets responded by raising prices when payment came in paper. Accepting notes was mandatory, but vendors could demand more notes to compensate for their declining real value. He attempted to prevent capital flight through progressively stricter currency controls. Exporting precious metals became illegal entirely, not just limited. Possessing gold or silver objects above certain weights was prohibited. Aristocratic families had to surrender silver tableware and gold jewelry to government officials. These measures transformed law's monetary system from innovative financial reform into explicit coercion. The government was forcing people to use paper currency by making metallic alternatives illegal. The enforcement of these regulations generated black markets and corruption. Officials charged with confiscating precious metals took bribes to overlook violations. Smuggling networks developed to move gold and silver out of France, despite legal prohibitions. Wealthy families discovered ways to convert assets to portable forms, gemstones, art, foreign letters of credit, that could preserve wealth outside the increasingly dysfunctional paper system. The regulations law hoped would stabilize his system, instead demonstrated its fundamental illegitimacy. What's interesting is that law's descent into coercive measures paralleled his growing desperation. His early banking operations had been genuinely voluntary. Merchants used his notes because they were convenient and secure, not because they were legally required to. The shift to mandatory acceptance and forced circulation marked his recognition that voluntary confidence had failed. He was trying to implement by decree what he couldn't maintain through performance. Law also attempted to manipulate supply and demand directly through share buybacks. The Compagnie des Indes would repurchase its own shares using banknotes, supporting the share price through government-funded purchases. This consumed enormous quantities of notes, temporarily reducing the money supply, which briefly stabilized note values. But the logic was circular. Using depreciating currency to buy overvalued shares didn't create real value. It merely shuffled paper around while destroying the bank's remaining credibility. These buyback operations did generate one perverse benefit. They allowed well-connected insiders to exit positions at above-market prices. Aristocrats with access to law or Philippe could sell shares to the company at official prices higher than black market rates. This was essentially using government resources to bail out politically connected speculators at the expense of ordinary shareholders who lacked the same access. The preferential treatment generated justified rage among those who noticed the favoritism. Law proposed increasingly baroque regulatory schemes to manage the crisis. He suggested creating different classes of shares with different redemption priorities. He proposed converting notes to long-term bonds that wouldn't be immediately redeemable. He offered schemes to gradually retire paper while maintaining economic activity. None of these proposals addressed the fundamental problem. The quantity of paper claims vastly exceeded underlying real value, and no amount of clever restructuring could change that arithmetic. Philippe's support for law was finally breaking under the pressure. The regent faced political crisis as criticism of the financial disaster intensified. Opposition nobles demanded law's removal. Parliamentary institutions that Philippe had struggled to control throughout his regency now had legitimate grievances about economic mismanagement. Public protests were becoming dangerous. Crowds gathered outside the Palais Royal, shouting for law's arrest. Philippe needed to demonstrate action. and removing law became politically necessary. On May 29, 1720, Philippe dismissed Law as Controller General of Finances. Law retained control of the bank and company temporarily, but losing the finance ministry position signaled his falling from power. The man who'd controlled France's entire economic apparatus just weeks earlier was being systematically stripped of authority as scapegoating began. Law's response showed his continued belief that proper policy could solve the crisis. He submitted detailed reform proposals to Philippe, outlining pathways to stabilize currency and restore confidence. These proposals showed sophisticated understanding of the technical problems, but ignored the political reality that Law's credibility was too damaged for any of his suggestions to be acceptable. Nobody trusted him anymore, which meant none of his solutions, however technically sound, could be implemented. By August 1720, Law's remaining authority was eliminated. The Banque Royale was stripped of its royal charter and converted to a state-controlled institution managed by officials not associated with Law. The Compagnie des Indes came under government supervision. Law retained personal wealth temporarily, properties purchased during the boom, shares held in various ventures, but his power was completely gone. The transition from absolute control to complete powerlessness happened with remarkable speed. 4 months elapsed between Law's peak authority in May and his total removal in September. The same momentum that had carried him upward during the boom operated in reverse during the collapse. Success had generated success, failure generated failure. The feedback loops worked both directions. Law's desperate measures failed because they attempted to solve a crisis of confidence through coercion. Confidence can't be mandated by decree. Currency that requires legal enforcement to achieve acceptance isn't functioning as money. It's functioning as taxation without representation. People won't voluntarily accept paper they believe is worthless, no matter how many laws require acceptance. Law discovered that economic systems ultimately rest on voluntary cooperation, and voluntary cooperation requires trust that he'd irrevocably destroyed. The months of desperate measures achieved nothing except accelerating the system's collapse and intensifying popular rage against Law personally. Each new regulation, each forced acceptance decree, each attempt to manipulate markets through government power deepened the recognition that Law's system was bankrupt and that its architect was either delusional about the possibility of recovery or cynically trying to protect himself while others suffered. By winter 1720, Law's physical safety was genuinely threatened. The desperate measures had failed, the system had collapsed, and the man who'd promised to make France wealthy through paper currency innovation was fleeing for his life from the economic disaster he'd created. Chapter 10. Total Collapse. January 1721. The full magnitude of the disaster was becoming undeniable. The Compagnie des Indes, valued at over 10 billion livres at peak, was worth perhaps 500 million in real assets, a loss of 95%. The Banque Royale had issued notes worth over 2 billion livres, backed by reserves of perhaps 60 million, a ratio of 33 to 1 that made insolvency absolute. Thousands of families faced complete financial ruin. France's economy was in crisis. The experiment in paper currency had failed catastrophically. The government faced an impossible situation. Tens of thousands of people held paper notes and shares they'd believed were backed by government authority. These people demanded the government honor its implicit promises, but the quantities involved made comprehensive compensation impossible. France's entire annual tax revenue couldn't begin to cover the losses. Some people would have to bear losses, but deciding who and how much became a political and moral nightmare. Philippe appointed multiple commissions to investigate the disaster, assign blame and recommend solutions. These investigations produced volumes of testimony, analysis, and recrimination. The fundamental conclusions were unsurprising. Law's system had issued far more paper than underlying assets could justify. Speculation had created unsustainable valuations, and government oversight had been negligently inadequate. But these conclusions didn't provide practical solutions for the thousands of people holding worthless paper. The government implemented a partial default, disguised as restructuring. Paper notes were convertible to government bonds at dramatically reduced rates, perhaps 20% of face value. Compagnie des Indes shares were similarly converted at steep discounts. This was explicit recognition that paper values had been illusory, that claims would be honored at only a fraction of stated amounts. The losses would be distributed broadly, though not equitably, across everyone holding paper assets. This restructuring was probably necessary. Complete repudiation would have destroyed government credibility entirely, but it satisfied nobody. Note holders who'd believed government backing made their paper secure now received 1/5 of promised value. Shareholders who'd purchased at peak prices recovered almost nothing. The settlements were too generous for those who wanted law punished by total repudiation, too harsh for those who'd believed government promises. The economic disruption extended beyond financial losses. Trade remained severely depressed through 1721 because currency dysfunction made commerce difficult. Merchants reverted to barter in many cases, accepting goods directly rather than paper currency they didn't trust. Tax collection was chaotic because assessing obligations in a collapsed currency system was nearly impossible. Government operations struggled because revenues declined while expenses remained. Unemployment spiked as economic activity contracted. The speculation boom had drawn workers away from productive employment into financial services. Clerks, brokers, notaries serving the frenzy of trading. When speculation collapsed, these jobs disappeared. Traditional industries that had been neglected during the boom couldn't immediately reabsorb workers. The result was significant unemployment at precisely the moment when people had lost their savings and most needed income. Social unrest reflected the economic pain. Riots broke out sporadically in Paris and other cities throughout 1721. These weren't organized revolutionary movements, but spontaneous expressions of rage by people who'd lost everything and needed someone to blame. The targets were typically visible symbols of the failed system: the Banque Royale's offices, Law's former residences, government buildings associated with economic policy. What's interesting is that popular rage focused overwhelmingly on Law personally, rather than on Philippe or the regent's advisors. Law was foreign, which made him an easier scapegoat than native French officials. His exotic economic theories seemed like incomprehensible sorcery to ordinary people who'd lost their savings. His criminal past, the murder of Wilson, was resurrected and used to portray him as fundamentally untrustworthy. Philippe and his associates deflected blame effectively by positioning Law as the rogue architect whose schemes they'd insufficiently supervised. The political consequences threatened the regency's stability. Opposition nobles used the financial disaster to attack Philippe's authority generally. The Parlement de Paris, the judicial body Philippe had struggled to control throughout his regency, reasserted its prerogatives by investigating the crisis and criticizing government policy. Philippe survived politically, but his room to maneuver was constrained by the need to avoid further economic experiments that might revive criticism. France's international position suffered. Foreign governments and investors had lost confidence in French financial stability. International trade became more difficult as foreign merchants demanded payment in metal rather than French paper or credit. France's diplomatic influence declined as economic weakness became obvious. The nation that had been Europe's dominant power under Louis XIV was now viewed as economically unstable and poorly governed. The lessons other nations drew from France's disaster influenced European finance for decades. Britain, having experienced its own simultaneous South Sea bubble collapse, implemented restrictions on joint stock companies that remained in force for over a century. Other nations approached paper currency and central banking with extreme caution. The failures of 1720 convinced most policymakers that precious metal-backed currency, while limiting economic flexibility, was safer than paper innovations that could collapse spectacularly. Look, the total collapse wasn't instantaneous. It unfolded over months as each component of Law's integrated system failed sequentially. But the direction was clear from mid-1720 onward. Each attempt to stabilize one component destabilized another. The bank's attempts to support share prices consumed reserves needed to back currency. Currency restrictions designed to prevent reserve drain destroyed confidence. Share buybacks that temporarily stabilized prices depleted government funds. The system was comprehensively failing, and no interventions could prevent the ultimate collapse. By mid-1721, over a year after the peak of speculation, France's economy had stabilized at a much lower level of activity. Paper currency had been mostly withdrawn, replaced by metallic coinage. The Compagnie des Indes continued to exist as a government-supervised trading monopoly, but at realistic valuations, rather than speculative prices. Government debt remained enormous, but was at least quantified and structured. The crisis had passed, leaving behind massive losses and bitter memories. The human stories behind the collapse were often tragic. Families that had been comfortable saw their wealth evaporate. Elderly people living on fixed incomes from government bonds saw those incomes reduced by 80%. Young merchants who'd mortgaged everything to speculate lost their businesses and faced bankruptcy. The aggregate statistics: billions of livres in paper wealth vanished, thousands of families ruined, represented individual catastrophes that played out in homes across France. Some committed suicide rather than face the consequences of total financial ruin. Contemporary accounts mention numerous cases of speculators who'd leveraged everything, lost it all, and couldn't cope with the fall from temporary wealth to complete poverty. These deaths were tragic footnotes to the larger disaster, individual victims of collective madness. Others adapted and eventually recovered. Families with diversified assets, land that couldn't be liquidated during speculation, foreign holdings not subject to French currency chaos, skills that remained valuable regardless of financial turmoil, survived the crisis and eventually prospered again. France's economy, while severely damaged, hadn't been destroyed. Productive capacity remained. Over time, economic activity recovered, though trust in financial innovation remained impaired for generations. The total collapse of Law's system represented perhaps the most spectacular financial failure in European history to that point. The scale of paper wealth destruction, the speed of the reversal from boom to bust, and the severity of economic and social consequences created a legendary cautionary tale that influenced financial thinking for the next century. John Law's name became synonymous with reckless speculation, paper money dangers, and financial catastrophe. The fact that his theories contained genuine insights, that his innovations anticipated future financial developments, that his intentions had been at least partly sincere, all of this was overwhelmed by the magnitude of the failure. He'd promised prosperity through monetary innovation. He'd delivered disaster. The total collapse was complete by 1721. The paper empire had vaporized. The economic damage would require years to fully repair, and the man who'd engineered the entire spectacular boom and bust was living in exile, disgraced, stripped of wealth and power, waiting for a death that would come almost unnoticed 8 years later. Chapter 11. Exile's End. Venice in the 1720s was a city in decline, living on the glories of its republican past while sliding toward irrelevance. It was fitting that John Law ended his life there. Both man and city were past their peaks, remembered more for what they'd once been than for what they'd become. Law arrived in Venice around 1724 after wandering through various European cities, never welcome anywhere for long, carrying the stain of his catastrophic failure in France. The contrast with his years of power was absolute. In 1720, Law had controlled the finances of Europe's largest kingdom, advised the regent on every major policy decision, and commanded wealth measured in hundreds of millions. 5 years later, he lived in rented rooms, survived on modest gambling winnings and occasional financial support from distant relatives, and possessed only minor fame among Venice's intellectual circles, who found his economic theories abstractly interesting despite their disastrous practical implementation. Law's daily life in Venice followed simple patterns. He frequented coffee houses where merchants, travelers, and intellectuals gathered to discuss politics and commerce. He gambled regularly but modestly. The mathematical skills that had sustained him during his first exile after Wilson's murder remained sharp, allowing him to earn supplemental income at card tables. He wrote, composing defenses of his theories and explanations of what had gone wrong in France. Though these writings circulated only among small academic audiences, Catherine remained with him, maintaining their household despite financial constraints and social obscurity. Their relationship, which had begun scandalously when both were exiles avoiding conventional society, persisted through Law's spectacular rise and catastrophic fall. She managed their limited resources, maintained correspondence with contacts who occasionally provided financial assistance, and supported Law's increasingly futile efforts to rehabilitate his reputation. Their children had scattered. John, their son, pursued his own life separate from his father's notoriety. Mary Catherine, their daughter, made a respectable marriage eventually, distancing herself from the scandal of Law's name. The family that had briefly enjoyed wealth and proximity to power was dispersed, maintaining only loose connections. Law's writings from the Venice period show a mind still sharp but increasingly bitter. He continued to argue that his fundamental theories were correct, that paper currency was superior to metallic currency, that credit expansion could stimulate economic growth, that his system had failed due to mismanagement and excessive speculation rather than flawed theory. These arguments were partly self-justification, partly genuine belief. Law never fully accepted that his theoretical insights, however sophisticated, had been insufficient for practical implementation. His defense writings blamed several factors for the Mississippi system's collapse. He argued that Philippe had pressed for overly rapid expansion, that speculators had driven prices beyond sustainable levels despite his warnings, that currency restrictions had been implemented too late, that political opposition had undermined confidence. All of these claims contained partial truth, but they also served to deflect responsibility from Law himself for creating the unstable system in the first place. What's interesting is that Law's theoretical writings from this period actually contained important insights that later economists would rediscover. His understanding of the relationship between money supply and economic activity anticipated key concepts in modern monetary theory. His recognition that credit could mobilize idle resources presaged 20th century ideas about using financial policy to manage economic performance. But these insights were buried beneath the disaster's overwhelming legacy. Law attempted to interest various European governments in scaled-down versions of his banking plans. He proposed establishing banks in several Italian city-states, offering to implement conservative versions of his currency system that would avoid the excesses that destroyed his French operations. None of these proposals gained serious consideration. Law's name carried too much negative association for anyone to risk implementing his ideas, regardless of theoretical merit. He also reached out to British officials occasionally, proposing that Britain might benefit from banking innovations similar to what he'd attempted in France, but managed more conservatively. These overtures were rebuffed or ignored. Britain had experienced its own South Sea bubble collapse and had no interest in financial experiments from the architect of France's even worse disaster. Law's exotic ideas might have seemed innovative in 1716. By 1726, they seemed like recipes for catastrophe. His health began declining in the late 1720s. The exact nature of his illness isn't clearly documented. 18th century medicine didn't diagnose conditions with modern precision, but contemporary accounts mention gradual weakening, respiratory problems, and general physical deterioration. He was in his late 50s, not particularly old by modern standards, but past the typical life expectancy for his era, especially for someone who'd lived the stressful life Law had experienced. Look, Law must have reflected on the gap between his ambitions and his actual legacy during those final years in Venice. He'd intended to revolutionize finance, to make France prosperous, to implement theories he'd been developing since his gambling days in London 3 decades earlier. He'd achieved unprecedented power and influence, proving his ideas could win acceptance at the highest levels. And it had all collapsed spectacularly, leaving him exiled again, living on modest means. Remembered primarily as a cautionary tale about financial excess. His death came in March 1729. The circumstances were unremarkable. He simply weakened and died, attended by Catherine and a few associates. There was no dramatic finale, no final vindication, no deathbed wisdom that somehow redeemed the disaster. He died as he'd lived those final years, quietly, obscurely, far from political power, no longer relevant to the financial and political developments shaping Europe. The burial took place at the Church of San Moise in Venice, a minor ceremony attended by few people. Law's grave marker identified him simply, without elaborate titles or achievements, the man who'd been Controller General of France, Director of the Banque Royale, and the most powerful economic voice in Europe was interred as just another foreign resident who died in Venice. Contemporary reports of Law's death focused primarily on summarizing the Mississippi system's disaster, rather than mourning his passing. Newspapers across Europe carried brief notices mentioning his death, and invariably included paragraphs about the financial catastrophe he'd engineered. His obituary was essentially a reminder of failure, rather than a tribute to achievement. Catherine survived him, living for some years after Law's death, eventually dying in obscurity herself. The Law family faded into historical footnote status, remembered only in connection with John's spectacular rise and fall. There were no descendants who carried forward the family name with distinction or rehabilitated Law's reputation through their own achievements. The exile's end was appropriately quiet for someone who'd become irrelevant during his own lifetime. Law's moment had passed, his theories were discredited, and his legacy was overwhelmingly negative. He'd attempted something genuinely revolutionary, applying mathematical and theoretical insights to national economic management, and had failed catastrophically. The failure overshadowed everything else. Yet even in death, Law's story retained fascination. The sheer scale of his rise from fugitive murderer to economic dictator and back to obscure exile was inherently dramatic. The Mississippi Bubble became one of history's legendary financial disasters, studied by economists, historians, and anyone interested in speculation and financial manias. And at the center of that disaster was always John Law, the brilliant, reckless, tragic figure who'd believed mathematics could control human nature, and had been proven catastrophically wrong. He died in exile, disgraced, stripped of wealth and power, largely forgotten by the world he'd briefly dominated. It was a quiet, somewhat pathetic end for someone who'd attempted to revolutionize European finance and had come remarkably close to succeeding before everything collapsed. Chapter 12: Economic Legacy. The immediate legacy of John Law's Mississippi system was overwhelmingly negative. For at least a century after the 1720 collapse, Law and Mississippi Bubble were invoked as cautionary warnings against paper currency, central banking, and financial innovation generally. French economic policy remained deeply conservative through the 18th century, avoiding the monetary experimentation that might have facilitated growth. Even during the French Revolution, when radical changes swept through virtually every aspect of French society, monetary policymakers remembered Law's disaster and implemented their own paper currency, the assignats, with extreme caution that ultimately proved insufficient to prevent another collapse. The broader European reaction to Law's failure was similarly conservative. Britain's Bubble Act of 1720, passed in direct response to the South Sea Bubble but influenced by France's simultaneous disaster, restricted joint stock company formation for over a century. Other nations implemented regulations limiting banking innovations and constraining paper currency issuance. The 18th century became a period of financial caution across Europe, with Law's failure serving as the spectacular example of what could go wrong when theory exceeded prudence. This conservative reaction probably slowed European economic development. Law had been fundamentally correct that rigid, precious metal-based currency systems constrained economic growth. Economies with expanding productive capacity needed expanding money supplies to facilitate increasing transaction volumes. The post-Law reaction, by reinforcing metallic currency systems, maintained the very constraints Law had tried to overcome. European economic growth in the 18th century was arguably slower than it could have been with more flexible monetary arrangements, but the conservative reaction was also understandable. Law's disaster had inflicted genuine suffering on thousands of families and nearly destabilized the French government. The scale of paper wealth destruction, billions of livres evaporated, was unprecedented. People who'd suffered through the Mississippi Bubble or witnessed its aftermath had entirely rational reasons to distrust paper currency and banking innovation. The psychological trauma of the collapse generated risk aversion that shaped policy for generations. What's interesting is that many of Law's theoretical insights were eventually vindicated, though it took decades, or even centuries. His understanding that money supply should expand with economic activity became foundational to modern monetary theory. His recognition that credit could mobilize resources anticipated Keynesian economics. His vision of central banking as a tool for managing national economic performance predated the Federal Reserve by 2 centuries. Law was right about much of the theory, even though his implementation was disastrously wrong. Modern central banking, the system that governs virtually every developed economy today, operates on principles law articulated. Central banks issue paper currency backed by government authority rather than precious metals. They expand and contract money supply to manage economic activity. They serve as lenders of last resort during financial crises. They attempt to maintain price stability while supporting full employment. These functions would all be familiar to law, even though the institutional frameworks and analytical tools have become far more sophisticated. The difference between law's failed experiment and modern successful central banking lies primarily in institutional constraints and accumulated experience. Modern central banks operate with explicit mandates, political independence designed to resist pressure for excessive issuance, and sophisticated understanding of how much money supply expansion an economy can absorb without triggering inflation. Law had none of these protections. He faced political pressure to solve fiscal problems through money printing, operated without independent institutional constraints, and lacked the economic theory to understand optimal issuance levels. Consider the Federal Reserve, established in 1913 after multiple American financial panics, demonstrated the need for coordinated monetary management. The Fed operates on principles law would recognize. It issues paper currency backed by government authority. It manages credit availability to influence economic activity. It attempts to prevent or mitigate financial crises. But the Fed has institutional independence law lacked, operates within legal frameworks, constraining its discretion, and draws on 2 centuries of monetary economics that didn't exist in law's time. The European Central Bank, the Bank of England, the Bank of Japan, all modern central banks, similarly implement sophisticated versions of law's basic insight that currency supply should be managed actively to support economic stability and growth. They've succeeded where law failed partly because they learned from his failure, incorporating safeguards against the excessive issuance and speculative manias that destroyed his system. Law's legacy also extends to understanding financial bubbles. The Mississippi bubble, along with the simultaneous South Sea bubble, became canonical examples of speculative mania and subsequent crash. Economists studying bubbles inevitably examine law's system as a case study in how speculation can drive prices far beyond any rational valuation. The psychological dynamics law unleashed, greed overcoming rational calculation, momentum driving prices higher purely because they'd been rising, panic reversing to complete crash, recur in financial bubbles from the 1929 stock market to the 2000 dot-com bubble to the 2008 housing crisis. The word millionaire itself emerged from the Mississippi bubble, coined to describe the suddenly wealthy speculators law's system created. This linguistic legacy outlasted the fortunes themselves. The millionaires of 1720 mostly lost their millions by 1721, but the term persisted, eventually becoming aspirational rather than cautionary. Law contributed a word to the English language that described financial success, even though the original millionaires were mostly victims of speculation rather than examples of sustainable wealth creation. You see, Law's story also became a morality tale about the dangers of excessive cleverness, divorced from practical wisdom. He possessed brilliant mathematical ability and sophisticated theoretical insights, but insufficient understanding of human psychology and political constraints. His failure illustrated the limits of pure rationality in systems driven by emotional dynamics. This lesson resonates beyond finance. The idea that theoretical brilliance must be tempered by practical understanding of human behavior applies to many fields where mathematical models meet messy reality. Modern economists who study Law's system reach mixed conclusions. Some emphasize his genuine theoretical insights and view his failure as implementation error rather than conceptual flaw. Others argue that his theories were fundamentally flawed because they underestimated the difficulty of maintaining confidence in paper currency. Most acknowledge both his theoretical sophistication and his practical failure, recognizing him as a tragic figure whose vision exceeded his ability to implement successfully. France specifically took over a century to fully embrace paper currency and central banking after Law's disaster. The Bank of France, established in 1800, operated extremely conservatively initially, maintaining high reserve ratios and limiting note issuance carefully. Napoleon, who chartered the Bank of France, had studied the Mississippi system and was determined to avoid repeating Law's mistakes. The French monetary system remained cautious through the 19th century, which arguably limited French economic growth relative to Britain and eventually Germany. The question remains, was Law a visionary ahead of his time, or a reckless gambler who got lucky briefly before inevitable disaster? The answer is probably both. His theories contained genuine insights that anticipated future financial developments. His implementation was recklessly aggressive, ignoring obvious warning signs, allowing speculation to spiral out of control, and ultimately causing the catastrophe his critics had predicted. Brilliance and recklessness coexisted in Law's character, and both are essential to understanding his legacy. Think about the counterfactual. What if Law had implemented his system more conservatively? What if the Banque Royale had maintained higher reserve ratios? If share issuance had been slower and more disciplined? If speculation had been controlled more aggressively? Could a more carefully managed version of Law's innovations have succeeded? Probably yes. Something resembling Law's system, implemented with greater caution and better safeguards, could have worked. That's essentially what modern central banking represents. Law's vision implemented with the constraints his system lacked. The tragedy of John Law was that he was simultaneously right and wrong. Right that paper currency offered advantages over metallic currency. Right that banking innovation could support economic growth. Right that credit expansion could mobilize resources. Right that monetary management required active intelligence rather than passive adherence to metallic standards. But wrong about the speed of implementation. Wrong about how much expansion systems could sustain. Wrong about his ability to control speculation. Wrong about confidence's fragility. Wrong about the psychological forces his system would unleash. His legacy is therefore complex and contradictory. Modern economics vindicated many of his insights while acknowledging his disastrous failure. His name remains associated with financial catastrophe, even as his theories influenced successful subsequent developments. He demonstrated both the potential of financial innovation and the catastrophic risks of implementing innovations recklessly. The Mississippi Bubble and John Law's role in creating it remains one of history's most studied financial episodes. Business schools teach it as a case study in speculation and crash dynamics. Economic historians analyze it for insights into early modern finance. Popular histories retell it as dramatic narrative of rise and fall. Law himself remains a fascinating figure, brilliant, flawed, visionary, reckless, successful, catastrophically failed. In the end, Law's economic legacy defies simple assessment. He was too successful to dismiss as a mere fraud, too disastrously failed to celebrate as a visionary. He understood things about money and economics that his contemporaries didn't grasp, yet he lacked crucial understanding about implementation, psychology, and political constraints. He shaped financial history significantly, both through his innovations and through his spectacular failure that influenced policy for the next century. The Scottish gambler who'd killed a man over debts, who'd won and lost fortunes at card tables across Europe, who'd convinced a regent to let him control France's economy, who'd created paper fortunes and then destroyed them catastrophically, this complex, brilliant, flawed figure left a legacy that continues to resonate 3 centuries later. Every time a central bank adjusts interest rates, every time a government considers monetary policy, every time investors chase rising asset prices into bubble territory, John Law's ghost is there, both warning and inspiring, representing both the potential of financial innovation and the catastrophic costs of getting it wrong. So we've seen how John Law rose from convicted murderer and professional gambler to controller general of France, how he implemented sophisticated economic theories that anticipated modern monetary policy, how he created a speculative bubble that briefly made thousands wealthy before collapsing catastrophically, and how he ended his life in obscure exile while his innovations, stripped of his name, eventually became foundations of contemporary finance. Today, 3 centuries after the Mississippi bubble's collapse, we live in an economic system that would be recognizable to John Law in its basic operations while differing dramatically in its safeguards and sophistication. Every major economy operates with paper currency, backed by government authority rather than precious metals, exactly what Law proposed. Central banks actively manage money supply to influence economic activity, exactly what Law envisioned. Credit expansion enables investment and growth, exactly what Law argued. The global economy depends on confidence in paper assets whose value rests on collective agreement rather than intrinsic worth, exactly the system Law tried to create. But modern monetary systems also incorporate lessons from Law's failure. Central banks operate with institutional independence, designed to resist political pressure for excessive money printing. Reserve requirements and regulatory frameworks constrain how much credit can expand. Sophisticated macroeconomic theory guides decisions about money supply growth rates. International coordination mechanisms prevent the isolated excesses that a single nation might attempt. These safeguards represent centuries of accumulated experience, much of it learned through disasters like the Mississippi bubble. The word millionaire that emerged from Law's speculation still describes financial success, though today's millionaires are far more numerous and their wealth is hopefully more sustainable than the paper fortunes of 1720. The understanding that asset prices can become disconnected from underlying value remains relevant. Every modern financial bubble, from 1929 to 2008, echoes dynamics Law unleashed 300 years ago. The recognition that paper wealth is psychologically real but potentially ephemeral continues to shape how we think about financial systems. When you step back and look at the full picture, Law's legacy is neither entirely positive nor entirely negative. It's deeply ambivalent. He demonstrated that monetary innovation could dramatically expand economic possibilities, but also that poorly managed innovation could cause catastrophic damage. He showed that theoretical sophistication without practical wisdom leads to disaster, but also that theoretical insights can eventually be vindicated if implemented more carefully by subsequent generations. He proved that individual brilliance could reshape national economies, but also that such reshaping requires institutional frameworks beyond individual genius to sustain. The real lesson here isn't simply beware speculation or paper currency is dangerous. These are oversimplifications. The deeper insight is that financial systems are fundamentally psychological, that they depend on confidence which can be rational one moment and irrational the next, that the same mechanisms enabling productive expansion can generate destructive bubbles, and that managing these dual possibilities requires not just mathematical sophistication, but profound understanding of human behavior under conditions of uncertainty and emotional stress. Law understood the mathematics of probability and the economics of currency better than virtually anyone in his era. What he didn't understand sufficiently was how quickly confidence could shift from rational optimism to manic speculation, and from fragile concern to panic collapse. Modern central bankers, equipped with Law's theoretical insights plus 3 centuries of experience in managing these psychological transitions, attempt to maintain the stability Law couldn't achieve. They succeed more often than they fail, but the 2008 financial crisis, when confidence collapsed and credit froze despite sophisticated regulatory frameworks, demonstrates that the fundamental challenges Law faced haven't been entirely solved even today. So the question remains, should we remember John Law as a visionary who anticipated modern finance, or as a reckless gambler who nearly destroyed France's economy? Perhaps the most accurate answer is that he was both simultaneously, that his vision and his recklessness were inseparable aspects of the same ambitious personality, and that his legacy is therefore necessarily contradictory, part inspiration for modern monetary systems, part warning about the catastrophic potential of those same systems when confidence fails. Whether we like it or not, we live in the economic world John Law helped create. Paper currency, central banking, active monetary management, credit expansion, these are all implementations of principles Law articulated 300 years ago. The fact that his implementation failed catastrophically didn't invalidate the underlying insights. It simply demonstrated that theory must be tempered by practical constraints, that innovation must be implemented carefully, and that financial systems require robust institutional frameworks to prevent the excesses individuals inevitably pursue when freed from adequate oversight. 3 centuries after the Mississippi bubble burst, we're still grappling with the same fundamental tension law confronted: how to harness the productive potential of paper finance while managing the speculative and panic dynamics that paper finance enables. We've gotten better at this balance, but we haven't perfected it, and perhaps we never will. John Law's spectacular failure reminds us that financial innovation offers enormous potential benefits and equally enormous risks, and that the difference between brilliant success and catastrophic failure often depends on details of implementation that seem minor until they prove decisive. The Scottish gambler who became France's financial dictator left a legacy as complex as his character: part genius, part fool, part visionary, part disaster, part inspiration, part warning. Understanding his story helps us understand the financial systems we live with today, and the delicate balances those systems must maintain to function without collapsing. That understanding seems more relevant than ever in an era when paper wealth accumulation continues to dramatically exceed real economic growth, when speculation remains endemic in financial markets, and when maintaining confidence in currency systems backed by nothing but government authority and collective belief remains the fundamental challenge Law identified 300 years ago, but couldn't solve.